About this because this is fascinating. I remember very clearly, I think anybody who was alive at the time does. I remember my parents waking me up and we went down and we watched you guys land on the moon.
No,
which
you didn't.
was
No, you didn't.
What?
Because there wasn't any television. There wasn't anybody taking a picture. You watched animation. See, you associated what you saw with...
Buzz Aldrin is one of the most recognizable names in human history. On July 20th, 1969, he became the second human being to walk on the surface of the moon, just minutes after Neil Armstrong. That moment transformed him into an icon of exploration, a symbol of American achievement, and one of the defining figures of the space age. For more than 5 decades, people have asked Aldrin the same questions. What was it like to walk on the moon? What did you see? What did you feel? And throughout those years, his answers remained remarkably consistent. He spoke about the stark beauty of the lunar landscape, describing it as magnificent desolation, while explaining the technical challenges of the lunar module, the strange conditions on the surface, and the experiments he and Armstrong carried out. He became one of the most recognizable public faces of Apollo 11, appearing at ceremonies, giving speeches, and inspiring generations with the story of humanity's first steps onto another world. Yet, as the decades passed and Aldrin grew older, the way he spoke about Apollo began to attract renewed attention. In interviews and conversations that gradually reached wider audiences, he appeared to suggest that there were aspects of the mission that went beyond the familiar story presented in official accounts. Most notably, when the conversation turned to the question of why humans had not returned to the moon for more than half a century, his answers sometimes seemed to point towards something deeper than budgets, politics, or changing priorities. In one account, attributed to a 2023 interview, Aldrin was presented as making a statement that, if accurate, would dramatically change the way people viewed the end of the Apollo era. He said, "We didn't just stop going to the moon because of money. We stopped because of what we found there, what we saw, what we were told never to talk about." For decades, the conventional explanation for the end of Apollo has been straightforward. NASA's budget was reduced, political priorities shifted, public enthusiasm declined after the first successful landings, and once the United States had achieved the Cold War objective of reaching the moon before the Soviet Union, the enormous expense of continued lunar missions became increasingly difficult to justify. From a historical perspective, those factors provide a coherent explanation. But the idea that Aldrin believed there was more to the story creates a very different narrative, one in which the decision to stop exploring the moon was not simply a matter of economics, but potentially the consequence of discoveries that raised uncomfortable questions. That possibility is precisely what has made Aldrin's alleged statements so compelling to those who believe the Apollo story contains missing pieces. To understand why those claims attract so much attention, it is important to understand who Buzz Aldrin actually was before Apollo 11 ever happened. Edwin Eugene Buzz Aldrin Jr. was not selected merely because he was charismatic or because NASA needed a recognizable face for a historic mission. He was a highly accomplished military pilot and engineer who had flown 66 combat missions during the Korean War. He later earned a doctorate in astronautics from MIT, where his work on orbital rendezvous techniques contributed to the knowledge that would become increasingly important during America's space program. In 1963, he was selected as an astronaut, and 3 years later, he flew aboard Gemini 12. During that mission, Aldrin demonstrated that humans could perform demanding work outside a spacecraft for extended periods, helping solve one of the major practical problems facing future lunar missions. By the time NASA selected him for Apollo 11, he had already established himself as one of the program's most technically capable and disciplined astronauts. The mission ahead would be unlike anything humanity had attempted before. Landing 2 people on another world, operating there, and bringing them safely home required an extraordinary combination of engineering, training, courage, and precision. Aldrin was one of the people NASA trusted to make it possible. That history is what gives Aldrin's words their extraordinary power. He was not describing the moon from a laboratory or reconstructing events from photographs decades later. He had actually stood on the lunar surface. He spent more than 2 hours outside the lunar module, collected samples, deployed scientific instruments, photographed the surrounding terrain, and experienced the environment firsthand. Only a tiny group of human beings has ever had that experience. For decades, Aldrin presented Apollo 11 as the extraordinary but successful mission that history remembers. He spoke about the training, the technical difficulties, the teamwork, and the dangers they had overcome. When conversations turned toward unusual experiences or unexplained phenomena, he generally avoided sensational explanations and remained aligned with the broader NASA narrative. He represented the ideal astronaut: disciplined, technically knowledgeable, dependable, and deeply connected to the institution that had sent him to the moon. But time changes the way history is remembered. As the Apollo astronauts grew older, some began speaking more openly about subjects that had once been considered outside the boundaries of conventional space exploration. Edgar Mitchell, the 6th person to walk on the moon, became increasingly vocal about his belief in extraterrestrial intelligence and his conviction that governments possessed information about unexplained phenomena. Al Worden, who had orbited the moon during Apollo 15, also made provocative comments later in life concerning ancient civilizations and humanity's possible origins. Their statements did not establish that extraterrestrial artifacts had actually been discovered on the moon, but they contributed to a growing perception among some audiences that the Apollo astronauts knew more than the public had ever been told. As those men passed away, their first-hand experiences became part of history, leaving behind statements, memories, and unanswered questions that continue to fuel speculation. For Aldrin, who remained one of the most prominent surviving members of that generation, the passage of time added another dimension to the story. The official record of Apollo 11 remains far more straightforward. Armstrong and Aldrin landed in the Sea of Tranquility on July 20, 1969, carried out their planned surface activities, collected lunar samples, deployed experiments, photographed the landscape, planted the American flag, and eventually returned to the lunar module before beginning their journey home. The mission achieved its primary objective and became one of the greatest technological accomplishments in human history. Apollo 11 demonstrated that humans could leave Earth, travel to another world, operate on its surface, and return safely. That is the story preserved in textbooks, documentaries, museums, archives, and generations of public memory. Yet the alternative account attributed to Aldrin suggests that the official record may not capture every detail of what the astronauts experienced during those hours on the lunar surface. According to that narrative, there were observations and experiences that never became part of the public version of Apollo 11. Whether those claims represent misunderstood observations, later interpretations, or evidence of something genuinely unexplained remains a critical question. And that is where the mystery surrounding Aldrin's story truly begins. In interviews over the past several years, Aldrin has reportedly described experiences that, according to this account, were never included in the original Apollo 11 mission reports. Among the details attributed to him are strange lights observed on the moon, illumination that he says did not resemble ordinary reflections or equipment lights, but instead appeared to move in ways that were difficult for him to explain. He has also described an unsettling sensation during the moonwalk, a persistent feeling that he and Armstrong were somehow being watched. According to the story, the sensation was strong enough that both astronauts noticed it, yet neither chose to mention it over the official communication channels. Even more unusual are the accounts involving what Aldrin has called time distortions. In this version of events, there were moments when his perception of time seemed to behave differently from the actual passage of time, with minutes seeming to disappear almost instantly and individual seconds feeling strangely prolonged. He reportedly remembers looking at his chronometer during the EVA and feeling that the progression of time did not correspond with his internal sense of duration. The claim goes further, suggesting that Armstrong experienced similar sensations but, like Aldrin, never formally reported them to Houston. If true, these would be extraordinary details, because they would suggest that the lunar environment produced perceptual effects the astronauts themselves could not easily explain. Yet the alleged perceptual anomalies were only the beginning. According to the narrative surrounding Aldrin's later statements, the most important event occurred when he and Armstrong looked toward the distant lunar horizon during the latter portion of their moonwalk. While they were working near the lunar module, Aldrin supposedly noticed something that seemed completely out of place against the barren landscape. At first, it was little more than a shape in the distance, something that appeared unusually regular compared with the natural terrain surrounding it. As he continued studying the object, however, its apparent geometry became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The form seemed angular, with straight edges and defined surfaces that appeared inconsistent with the irregular rocks and ridges scattered across the moon. Aldrin initially considered the possibility that it was nothing more than an optical illusion, perhaps created by the extreme contrast between brilliant sunlight and deep shadow. But, according to the account, the longer he observed it, the more convinced he became that he was looking at something physical rather than a trick of light. He then brought Armstrong's attention to the area, and the story claims that Armstrong looked toward the same location and independently recognized the anomaly. For the two astronauts, the question was no longer whether something unusual was visible, but what exactly they were looking at. The object was reportedly too distant for the astronauts to investigate directly within the limited time remaining in their surface operations. Their schedule was tightly controlled, their oxygen supply was finite, and every movement on the lunar surface had been carefully planned before launch. So, rather than attempting to reach the distant feature, the astronauts allegedly chose another option. They photographed it. According to this account, Aldrin and Armstrong captured several images in an attempt to document the anomaly from different positions and with different photographic settings. The purpose would have been simple but crucial: to preserve a record that could later be examined by scientists and mission planners. At the same time, the astronauts were aware that their communications were being monitored by mission control and could potentially be intercepted by other nations during the Cold War. If the object really appeared artificial, openly discussing it over the primary communication channel would immediately draw attention to something neither astronaut yet understood. The story therefore claims that they kept their observations off the public channel and waited for an opportunity to discuss the matter privately with Houston. According to the narrative, that opportunity came during a scheduled private medical communication. During this exchange, Armstrong allegedly reported what they had seen and asked Mission Control for guidance. The response, as the story tells it, was immediate and surprisingly restrained. Rather than directing the astronauts toward the anomaly or altering the mission plan, Houston supposedly instructed them to continue with their scheduled surface activities, complete the planned sample collection, and return to the lunar module. There was no investigation, no additional exploration, and no deviation from the carefully established timeline. The implication is that someone on the ground already understood the sensitivity of the situation or had decided that whatever the astronauts had observed should not become the focus of the mission. The alleged order was simple: continue the mission exactly as planned and leave the anomaly alone. The story then moves from the lunar surface to the aftermath of Apollo 11. According to the account, Once Armstrong and Aldrin returned to Earth and entered the extensive debriefing process, they were allegedly informed that the photographs connected to the anomaly would be classified. The images supposedly would not be released alongside the rest of the Apollo 11 photographic archive, and the astronauts were reportedly instructed not to discuss what they had seen outside a restricted circle of NASA and military personnel. If such an instruction existed, it would have placed the astronauts in an extraordinary position. They had just participated in one of humanity's greatest achievements, yet the most mysterious observation of their mission would supposedly remain hidden from the public. For decades, the story claims, Aldrin honored that silence. He watched as thousands of Apollo photographs became part of the historical record, while the images he believed were connected to the anomaly remained conspicuously absent. He continued speaking about Apollo 11 at ceremonies and public events, describing the landing and the challenges of the mission without publicly discussing what this narrative portrays as the most extraordinary discovery of his career. Then, according to the story, the passage of time changed Aldrin's relationship with that silence. Now well into his 90s, he is portrayed as increasingly unwilling to allow what he believes happened to disappear with his generation of astronauts. The narrative attributes to him a declaration that he would not take the secret to his grave. He reportedly argued that humanity deserved to know what the first lunar explorers had actually encountered, and suggested that their mission had produced evidence indicating that humans were not the first intelligence to reach the moon. The claim is presented as one of the reasons, according to this version of events, that humanity never returned. In this telling, the issue was not simply a lack of funding or political interest. The real concern was what further exploration might reveal. The alleged photographs form the center of that extraordinary claim. According to the narrative, when the images were supposedly examined after the mission, researchers identified what appeared to be a partially buried structure beneath the lunar regolith. Its apparent characteristics were described as unusually geometric, with straight edges, right angles, and symmetrical features. The object was also portrayed as extremely old, with its surfaces supposedly battered by countless micrometeorite impacts and buried beneath layers of lunar dust. Supporters of the story argue that the apparent age and condition of the object would make its existence even more significant. If the structure were genuinely artificial and ancient, it would imply that some form of technological intelligence had existed on the moon long before human beings reached it. The story claims that NASA responded by assembling a specialized team to examine the photographs and determine whether the apparent structure could be explained naturally. According to this account, the team supposedly included experts from several fields, including geology, engineering, archaeology, and military intelligence. Their alleged conclusion was extraordinary, that the object was probably artificial, that its apparent age could be measured by the density of cratering on exposed surfaces, and that its construction appeared to involve techniques far beyond known human capabilities. If such an analysis had actually reached that conclusion, the implications would have been enormous. It would not merely have added another mystery to the history of Apollo. It would have challenged fundamental assumptions about the development of intelligence, technology, and civilization within the solar system. The consequences would have extended far beyond science. An ancient artificial structure on the moon would force humanity to reconsider when and where technological intelligence had emerged, whether Earth was truly the first home of an advanced civilization, and whether the history of intelligence in the solar system was far older than conventional science currently recognizes. Such a discovery would have transformed Apollo 11 from a technological milestone into something entirely different, the moment humanity encountered evidence that it might not have been the first technological presence beyond Earth. In the narrative being presented, this was precisely why the discovery could not simply be announced. Instead, the alleged decision was made to preserve the familiar public story of Apollo 11, the successful landing, the scientific experiments, the lunar samples, and the safe return, while keeping anything anomalous outside the official narrative. The account further suggests that Aldrin struggled with the decision but understood why officials might have feared the consequences of an immediate disclosure. The world of 1969 was already deeply divided. The Cold War dominated international politics, the Vietnam War had created enormous social tension, and public trust in governments was increasingly fragile. Introducing evidence of an ancient non-human intelligence into that environment could, according to the story, have triggered religious upheaval, political instability, and intense geopolitical competition. The alleged reasoning was therefore not necessarily that the information would remain secret forever, but that humanity needed time before it could confront such a discovery. The expectation, if the story is believed, was that one day the evidence would be released when society was more prepared to understand it. More than 5 decades have now passed since Apollo 11. Yet, according to this narrative, that moment of disclosure never came. Instead, the alleged classification remained in place, leaving behind a mystery that could only be addressed by someone who had personally experienced the original event. This naturally leads to another question. If Apollo 11 had encountered something unusual, what happened during the missions that followed? Did NASA simply ignore the possibility, or did later astronauts return to the Moon with additional questions in mind? According to the account attributed to Aldrin, subsequent Apollo missions were not limited to their publicly announced scientific objectives. The story claims that some landing sites and orbital observations were selected partly because earlier missions or unmanned lunar probes had identified unusual features. Geological surveys and site-specific scientific research remained genuine objectives, but behind those public goals, the narrative alleges that classified secondary objectives were also assigned. These supposedly involved examining unusual formations, possible artifacts, and areas where the lunar surface appeared disturbed in ways that could not immediately be explained. The story then claims that the later missions repeatedly encountered anomalies. Some were allegedly geometric formations that appeared unusually precise. Others were areas where the regolith seemed disturbed, processed, or arranged. Still, others were described as partially buried objects that appeared to have been shaped deliberately rather than formed through ordinary geological processes. The astronauts were supposedly debriefed afterward and instructed to keep their observations confidential. Some, according to the narrative, maintained complete silence, while others later became more vocal about their belief that humanity might not be alone in the universe. Edgar Mitchell is often brought into this part of the story because of his later public statements about extraterrestrial intelligence and government secrecy. Taken together, the alleged pattern paints a picture of a NASA caught between two competing realities. Publicly, the agency remained focused on exploration, science, engineering, and the demonstration of American technological power. Privately, according to the story, officials were supposedly confronting discoveries that raised questions far more profound than the original mission objectives had anticipated. If those claims were true, every additional lunar mission would have carried the possibility of revealing more evidence, making continued exploration increasingly difficult to separate from the question of disclosure. But there is another side to the story, and it is the conventional explanation for why Apollo actually ended. After Apollo 17 in 1972, NASA's lunar program faced enormous financial and political pressures. The cost of sending astronauts to the Moon was immense. Public excitement had declined after the first few successful landings, and the United States government had other priorities competing for federal funding. NASA increasingly shifted its attention toward the space shuttle, while the political urgency that had driven the original moon race had largely disappeared. The Soviet Union had not sent humans to the lunar surface. The United States had already demonstrated its technological superiority, and Congress had little appetite for funding an expensive series of missions whose primary political objective had already been achieved. These explanations are well documented. Congress did reduce NASA's budget. Public interest did decline. The space shuttle did become the priority. From a conventional historical perspective, the end of Apollo can therefore be explained without invoking a hidden discovery. But the alternative narrative insists that these factors were only part of the story, and that behind the visible decisions was another reason that was never officially acknowledged. It is this tension between the documented history and the extraordinary claims attributed to Aldrin that keeps the mystery alive. The space shuttle eventually became NASA's new priority, and from the standpoint of conventional history, there is a straightforward explanation for why Apollo came to an end. The political objective had been achieved. The cost of lunar missions was enormous. Public enthusiasm was fading, and the United States was preparing to invest its resources in a new generation of spaceflight. But the alternative account attributed to Aldrin presents a very different interpretation. According to this version of the story, by 1972, NASA and government officials had supposedly accumulated enough unusual information from the Apollo missions to believe that the moon contained secrets capable of challenging some of humanity's most basic assumptions about its own history and place in the universe. The decision they faced, according to the narrative, was therefore not simply whether another lunar mission was worth the money. It was whether continued exploration might uncover additional evidence that would eventually make secrecy impossible. In this telling, the choice was made to end the lunar program, preserve what had already been discovered under classification, and redirect NASA toward other objectives. The claim goes even further, suggesting that such a decision could not have been made by NASA alone. According to the story, the matter would have involved senior government officials, military intelligence agencies, and perhaps even discussions extending beyond the United States. The alleged concern was that humanity in the early 1970s was not psychologically, politically, or culturally prepared for evidence of an ancient intelligence beyond Earth. A discovery of artificial structures on the moon, especially structures believed to predate human civilization by millions of years, would have raised profound questions about human origins, religious traditions, technological development, and the possibility that intelligence had existed elsewhere in the solar system long before humanity appeared. The narrative portrays officials as believing that disclosure could create consequences they could not control, leading them to conclude that keeping the information hidden was safer than confronting a discovery of such enormous implications. They decided it was safer to stop, Aldrin said. Safer to pretend the moon was just a dead rock we visited a few times and then lost interest in. Safer than admitting we found proof of intelligence that was there millions of years before humans existed. Supporters of this interpretation often point to the later statements of other Apollo astronauts as evidence that Aldrin's alleged concerns should not be dismissed immediately. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth human to walk on the moon, spent much of his later life discussing his belief that extraterrestrial intelligence was real and that governments had withheld information concerning unexplained phenomena. He appeared publicly, participated in interviews, and wrote extensively about the possibility that humanity might eventually have to confront the existence of non-human intelligence. Mitchell did not publicly establish that he had personally discovered an artificial structure on the moon, but his later comments became part of a broader discussion surrounding the possibility of extraterrestrial contact. Al Worden, meanwhile, who had orbited the moon during Apollo 15, also made controversial remarks later in his life about ancient civilizations and theories concerning humanity's